We talk a lot about asking questions, getting curious, and really thinking about who the people are that we're connecting with and how can we connect with them in a way that they care about, not just what we care about, but what they care about. And so that is what we're talking about today in this episode of the Digital Marketing Therapy Podcast, curiosity marketing, which isn't necessarily a term that I have heard a lot, but when Emily explains it, it's something that we definitely all should be incorporating into our marketing and that you might already be doing now. But it's not just about the marketing, it's about how do we kind of build this into our team culture as a whole so that we can better connect with people online and offline and encourage conversation, encourage engagement with our community and with donors. Emily Aborn writes for a living, and even she sometimes struggles to write for herself or about herself. Don't we all? As a copywriter, podcaster, and content marketing consultant, Emily helps small business owners overcome the blinking cursor of doom by taking writing, website copy, blogs, emails, and other marketing materials off their plate entirely. An entrepreneur for over a decade, Emily has experience in over 110 industries and has guided thousands of nonprofits and businesses to find their voice, make their impact, and connect with those who need them most. She lives in New Hampshire with her husband, Jason, and their dog, Clyde, and enjoys game nights, hiking, and a stack of emotional support books on her nightstand. We have such a fun conversation. It went by so fast. All of a sudden, we realized our time was up. But I think you're going to love this conversation because we really just talk through tangible ways to think about the types of people you're talking to and how to better connect with them and encourage more conversation. The more conversation you have, the more you know about potential donors, the easier it is to get that check and to get repeat gifts because you know you've made a real relationship with them and you've made a real connection, that you're giving them the information that they want and not what they don't want. So I think you'll enjoy this conversation, but before we get into it, it is brought to you by our free resources at the first click. We have a lot of amazing free downloadables for you to access, covering everything from your website to video to fundraising to self-care. And you can grab them all at thefirstclick.net/resources. They're all the way at the bottom of the page. But I think you'll find some resources that can really help support you where you're at in your organization. Now, don't go downloading them all. Pick the ones that are going to help you with where you're at right now. So with that, head on over to thefirstclick.net/resources, see what's there, and let's get into the episode. You're listening to the Digital Marketing Therapy Podcast. I'm your host, Sammy Bedell-Mulhern. Each month, we dive deep into a digital marketing or fundraising strategy that you can implement in your organization. Each week, you'll hear from guest experts, nonprofits, and myself on best practices, tips, and resources to help you raise more money online and reach your organizational goals. Hey friends, please join me in welcoming Emily Aborn to the podcast. Thanks for being here today.
Thank you so much for having me, Sammy. I'm so excited to be here.
Yeah, so, okay, let's talk about curiosity marketing, because I think when we hear the term, it might be new to us and we might have our own feelings about what that means. But what is curiosity marketing to you? How did you kind of stumble into this? Why is it so important to you to share with the world?
So let me tell you the story of how I discovered curiosity marketing, and then I'll define it for you so that we can kind of get on the same page about our definitions. So the way I kind of bumped into it is I was actually taking this 9-month SEO course, and over the process, there was homework. There was a lot of homework. And over the process of that 9 months, we would choose something each month that we would talk about on blogs, podcast episodes, emails, like it all had to be aligned. So sometimes I would go really granular and do things like, repurposing, or I might do podcast guesting, or I might do podcast hosting. So I would pick like real specific things like that. And sometimes I would choose very big words like visibility or intuition or curiosity. So one month I chose curiosity. And as I started researching curiosity, I realized that, we're using curiosity techniques in our marketing, in our writing, in our written and verbal communication, in our relationships all the time. So that kind of opened up this whole world to me on what is curiosity marketing? How can I use it to engage my listeners, to engage my readers, to invite my community in, rather than kind of shut those things down? Mm-hmm. So to define the term, like I'm not going to give you the perfect definition, but I'll give you a Emily definition. curiosity marketing is basically whenever you're able to open up a gap between what someone knows now and what they want to know. So think of curiosity as like, instead of like pushing someone to something or pushing something at someone, you're pulling them in. You're sort of like inviting them to take the next step. So think of like the last thing you were curious about, right? And like you're just like, oh, I have to turn the next page, or I have to go research that problem, or I have to ask that person that question because I want to know what makes them tick. So those are just different ways it can show up, but it's always like kind of inviting you to lean in and say like, go on.
I love that. Well, I think from the fundraising standpoint too, like it's such a cool concept to have that in your marketing, because we should be doing that as fundraisers in our conversations with one-on-one folks. Anyway, we should be asking more about them, learning about their motivation, so that we can provide answers to their curiosity and know that we're the right fit. So you're almost just, it's kind of like a different version maybe of like inbound marketing but like really more on a messaging connection kind of level, if that sounds correct to you.
Yes, that's 100%. And I think one good thing to know is there are different types of curiosity, and it's going to show up for different organizations differently. So I'm going to just there are 4 technical types of curiosity, and I think this is helpful because both your community is going to be in a certain place, and you as the organization might also be in a certain place, and you have to know what that is. So the first one is problem solver. This is the person that like, they will be curious about every fact, every piece of information, every resource they need to solve a problem. So you can see how you would use like, okay, I have to speak to the problem that they're facing to get them curious, right? Then there's like the fascinated. And this is kind of like the person I think of as like the multi-passionate. They're just like every fact, every piece of information, every piece of art. Like they're just curious about it all. Like they just want to know everything about anything. And their knowledge tends to be like very vast, but also very like not concentrated on any one thing.
Right.
And this might be a lot of your nonprofit's ideal community members because they're juggling a lot of things, right? Like maybe they have multifaceted lives. And so to kind of bring them in with curiosity, you have to speak to one of those facets. The other one is the empathizer. And I sort of get the impression from our beginning conversation in the green room, if you will, that this might be you. But this is a person who's just really, really curious about other people and like what information they have, what makes them tick, how we're alike, how we're different. Like it's all of that kind of interpersonal, social, psychological stuff that's really fun. And then the fourth one is hard to reach, and they're probably not listening to your podcast, but this is the, or mine, this is the avoider, and they just tend to be a lower, like they're very low on all the curiosity scales. And they don't tend to go actively look for something. They kind of like are waiting for it to come to them. So those are the different 4 types. And I think it's just helpful for us to know like, oh, as an organization or as a business owner or as a brand, I'm this and my ideal clients are this. So I might need to like think about talking in a different way to them. So that's just like, I like to set that stage because it gives you a place to go.
Well, and I love that because so it brings me back to a practical daily experience in my life, in that my husband is very much a why person. So like or a prove it, right? So if somebody says like, hey, the sky is blue, even though he can see it, he'll be like, well, tell me why it is and prove that that's true, right? Like he wants to know the why. Whereas I'm more like, oh, okay, yeah, I can see that. I believe that. Like I feel good about our relationship. Like I trust that you're telling me what you mean and we can move forward with this relationship. So it's really interesting, even in our own household, like when we make our own buying decisions, like what he scrutinizes versus what I do is very different in how we kind of move through that world and the organizations we want. And I think at the end of the day, for nonprofits, when you're dealing with these types of curiosity, it's very much tied to trust building, right? Like how can you build trust with these different personality types or curiosity types in order to get them to do the action you need them to do?
Yeah, because you're so right. Some people are going to be that more fact finder. I need the stats. I need the data. I need the information. It's funny. I fall between problem solver and empathizer. Those are like my top two. So I'll often like people are my most important thing, but when I'm trying to solve a problem, like do not get in my way. I will find every fact and information and like I must fix the problem and I can't rest until it's done. The other day I was in the co-op, like a local food co-op, and where you can round up right now and donate to the food bank. And I was like, oh, I want to do that. But first I needed to know the information on like, first I need to make sure my donation is going to the right place, right? And like, when is it going to be delivered to them? And then how much money have you raised so far? And am I able to see how much you raised this year over last year? And the lady just looked at me and she's like, don't worry, there's a sign by the door with all the stats. And I was like, okay, thank you. So you can see how it does. It does help you to, like, of course, the empathy was what got me, like that I want to help the people. And I also want to know the information and make sure that dollar is going to the right place.
Yep. So good. Whereas I would have just been like, yeah, that's fine, round up. Because I'm just like, that's cool. Not that anyone is better or worse. So that leads me to, if we're a smaller organization and we're kind of dealing with limited resources or we're already struggling with our marketing and our messaging, I hear 4 different types of curiosity. Now I'm immediately like, now I have to create 4 different messages and try to reach out to people. So you said earlier, matching who we are and matching that with who our ideal people are. So how do we kind of start to navigate through that process so that we can understand how to actually include this curiosity into our marketing without kind of feeling overwhelmed or confusing all of the people?
Great question. And actually, I wouldn't say we should try to speak to all the people at one time. I would actually really encourage people, no matter what you're writing, no matter what you're doing, to focus on just one person at a time. Before Sammy and I hit record, I asked her, like, paint the picture for me of your perfect listener. And like, the good news is I have a client very similar to that listener. And so like in my mind, she is the only person I'm thinking of. Yep. So in doing that, you actually get to be more universal. Like, let me give you a tangible example. So if I tell you to imagine like biting into an apple, it doesn't, I don't know what your brain is doing. I don't know how that experience was for you. I don't know what kind of apple you chose. But if I tell you to imagine biting into like just a slightly too tart, it's just like, a little tart Granny Smith apple. You can actually, like a lot of listeners will feel this, their cheeks will actually start to pucker up a little bit and you might salivate. So like being really specific in who you're speaking to can actually be beneficial for you. So when you're using these, be specific in just focusing on one person at a time. Like if you're writing a fact-based one and you're just giving facts and stats, focus on that, right? If you're writing to somebody who, you're speaking to their hearts and you're tugging on those empathetic strings, speak to that. If you're trying to raise awareness to solve a problem, speak to that.
Yeah. Well, and what I love about that is as you start to dive into this and as you start to create content for these different areas of curiosity and get specific, your audience will tell you who they are. So then you know where to double down, right? Like the data will tell you where you should be playing when you're starting to test these different types of messaging and styles of communication.
Yes, 100%. And listen when they tell us. Like, that's the number one way to be more curious, honestly, is just listen to what people are telling us and asking them questions about what matters most to them. So that's relationship 101.
Yeah. Okay, so a lot of organizations tend to talk very us forward. We're talking about us and all the amazing work we're doing. We're telling you all of the things. We're giving you all the stats. We're doing all the data, whatever. And in our online communication or in our marketing, we're not inviting really our audience to be curious with us. We're just kind of speaking at them. We're using a lot of jargon. We're using a lot of industry terms. So how can we maybe kind of shift in our minds, kind of opening the door for people to reach out? I mean, we need to invite the curiosity in our one-on-one conversations, but in the online space, how can we kind of encourage that engagement and encourage that back and forth conversation so that they do ask more questions and they do feel like we are a space where they can kind of come in as they are and learn what they want to learn about?
So a couple ideas on this, and I love this question. It's like one of my favorite. One is like opening with a question or some sort of statement or fact or piece of information that kind of hooks them in. And I really don't like the term hook, but it works because it really does like grab their attention.
But you mean hook with authenticity.
Yes.
We're not talking about hook for a clickbait to get clicks, right?
Yes, exactly. But asking a question is a good one. Like, have you ever considered right? Mm-hmm. Or is it important to you that You know who like weirdly does, this is not a nonprofit, but they do a really good job of this, is Airbnb. Like those commercials tell you exactly what your issues are with a hotel. They tell you exactly what your issues are with a generic stay. And then they show you how much better Airbnb is. They're so good at it, but they wrangle you in with like that kind of like hook. Like, have you ever, they're painting a picture for you. Have you ever experienced this? You're like, yes. Every hotel I've ever been to. So that's one way to do it, is like asking a question. Some depending on the brand, like it doesn't even need to be a relevant question. Like that's where I like personality and humor a little bit, and like sharing your fun facts. But let's put that aside because that's more of like a personal brand thing. The other one is using stories. So so I work for a local like trauma initiative. We're raising awareness about like trauma resources in our community. And one thing we love to do is share stories of organizations locally and like what they're actually doing in the community. And I think that's such a good one. It's not all about us, right? It's not just like, here's what we're doing as a community. We're like now shining the spotlight on somebody else and telling their story. And I think that's a good one. Like make them the hero, right? Make somebody else the hero and put them in a positive light. And then the other one, you talked about this, and I think this is so important, is just not overcomplicating with jargon and language. Like I can't even stress it enough, but some people don't even know like what a copywriter is. They think it's like that little C at the bottom of the website, right? So like using everyday I'm going to use a big word now, but vernacular, like everyday language that people can understand. So that means we just have to know who our reader is and know who our audience is. Some people are going to want the complex language, and we have to know that. Like you're going to speak to a scientist perhaps differently than you might speak to somebody at home caring for their family. So
yeah. Well, and we always say like write and interact at a 6th grade level, not because your audience is incapable of understanding something, but because there's so many messages coming at us, we need to be able to distill it as quickly as possible. If I have to read something and really process it and think about it and like try to figure out what it means, like you've lost me. But if I can get it in like 2 seconds, okay, now I'm inviting myself into, okay, maybe I do want to learn a little bit more, right? Which is, I think, exactly what you're saying. The example that I can share is I have a client who gets mad at me all the time for some of my messages. And it's because they're like, well, that's not what we do. That's a very simplistic version of what we do. And I was like, I get that. But what we're trying to do is not tell everybody what we're doing. We're trying to get them to say, oh, that's kind of cool. I get how that can be helpful. I want to learn more. And I think that's exactly what you're saying here is we don't need to share everything all at once with all the people. We need to really get specific and invite them to be curious about what we're doing and have that engagement and that continued conversation.
I want to give a really tangible tool for anyone that does struggle with that, speaking to that way over people's heads. So you can use an AI tool, and there are lots of tools out there that will show you what grade level you're writing at. And I really would echo what you said, like 6th grade is ideal. But I had a client who I think the technology told me it was grade 16. She's like, here's a good sample of my voice. Right. I don't even know what that means. Like, what is grade 16? But she said, here's a good sample of my voice. And so like everything she sent me was like 16, 12. And I was like, whoa. So I said, I'm going to show you your voice. I am going to reflect back your voice, but I'm also going to use like really everyday language of the people that are coming to work with you. And we brought it down to about an 8, which felt good to her. Like I could see in some situations you might not go lower than that, right? She was a therapist, so it kind of made sense to do that. But yeah, like you can use AI and these tools to help you. You can even ask it, how can I make this simpler? How can I speak to put in your very specific ideal community member. How can I speak to this person and speak in their language? So don't disregard. We give AI a lot of trouble, like in our minds sometimes, but don't disregard it as a tool that can actually help you create curiosity and speak specifically to people.
Well, I think that's a great tip, because you could write a long form blog post and take, kind of create the personas for your own organization to the 4 types of curiosity that you mentioned at the top of this episode, and create prompts to say, okay, now here's my one piece. Now write it for this, write it for this, write it for this. So you have your core piece, and you can easily kind of have some support in creating it for those various types of people that you can then arm your fundraising team with. Like, hey, when you're out in conversation, if you feel like the conversation is going this way, here's some messaging points. Like it's a great way to kind of learn and research and kind of figure out how you can have better conversations, and then mimic that in your online marketing.
Yeah. I would say the other idea that pops into my mind, which I think might be helpful for some nonprofits, is to not be afraid or shy away from sharing unique perspectives and insights. I'm not talking about hashtag vulnerability or hashtag unpopular opinion. I'm talking about when you actually have a real unique perspective on something, or you have a heartfelt message. So something locally happened in our community, and it would have been easy for this organization to just go on with their normal newsletter and not address it. But they actually wrote we worked to write a really heartfelt message about what had happened. And I think that was a really good way, because people are more curious when we're also curious and showing them that we care about them, right? So don't shy away from really taking your stand sometimes and showing a different perspective or a different insight into something that you as an organization can have. That is not blanket advice. They're totally,
time and place.
I like to be clear. There's nuance, there's time, there's place. It has to align with your values. There's a lot to consider. But I think it can be really powerful in creating that curiosity and that connection.
Well, and I love that. And I want to flip that into, a lot of times we don't stand up for things if they're relevant to the work that you're doing, right? If they make sense. We don't necessarily maybe stand out because we don't want people to not give to us because we're trying to be all things to all people, right? And I think in that case, maybe you got deeper relationships and got more trust from the people that are the right fit for donors for your organization. And maybe some people were like, well, I don't know, I don't know the situation, but maybe some people are like, you know what, that organization is not right for me. But that's okay, because you don't want money from everybody, because they're not going to continue to give, and you're just going to spend a lot more effort. So in situations like that, as we're kind of thinking about how do we invite people to be curious, how do we show that we're curious and that we're open to conversation and that we're a part of the community, not just these people doing these things. How do we make sure that we kind of push away the right people and invite the right people in for curiosity, and that we're not kind of shutting our doors and kind of putting up a hard wall and saying, well, this is what we're doing. You like it or leave it. That's not what I'm saying. There's that fine line there. I'm not really saying that well, but I think maybe you get what
I understand what you're saying. And I think some of it we talked about with being specific, but because the specific can be universal. But I think even more importantly, here's what I love. And I really stand by this and do this in my own podcast and content. It's not being prescriptive or it's our way or the highway, right? It's this or that. This is the truth. This is not. And I think that shuts down a lot of curiosity. It closes a loop. So anything that I try to think of it like anything that closes a loop and is just definitive or prescriptive or everybody should do this. Everybody should think this. That's an indicator.
Yeah.
Those kind of things are things I really would invite us all to consider avoiding. And some of the way to do that is simply by what I just did. I would invite us all to consider exploring, right? So even thinking of things like that. But whenever we're being prescriptive, it's usually an indication that you might be shutting down the curiosity of your community. And it might even be the people who are interested. Yeah. You might be shutting it down.
So how do we kind of create this culture? You talked earlier about how we want to we want to understand who we are as an organization. We've talked a little bit about how to talk to other people and encourage that. But how do we kind of build that into our team and kind of create a culture of curiosity into how we show up? Because, we're talking about marketing on this podcast all the time, but we also talk about it's not just what we do online. It's how we talk to people in person. It's how we, how we write our voice and our content, how we show up on social media, how we show up at events. So how do we kind of create that culture within our team? Because you said should is the bad word. The other phrase that we hate is, well, that's just the way it's always been done. And there's a lot of that in the development space. So how do we kind of build this into who we are as an organization? Because that can be tricky.
Okay, first I want to highlight something amazing you just did to make me curious. Just asking that question, first of all, it's a different question than I've ever been asked. And so it gets my brain excited, right? And that's all curiosity is. It's just getting our brain excited. So one of the ways to do it is to ask different questions in your organization. Instead of saying, okay, actually I'm going to use a really basic example. Let's say I come up to you at a networking event and I'm like, so Sammy, what do you do? How many times have you been asked that question? You're like, oh my God, do I have to answer this again? Right? I blah, 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 blah. So instead of asking that, ask something that engages somebody's curiosity. Sammy, what are you working on right now? Or what are you focused on in 2025? So asking something like that, that's I'm going to learn about what you do when you answer that question for me, most likely. But it just kind of, the listener hears it and they're like, okay. So thinking throughout your organization, in your team meetings, what if you start with what are you all excited about today? Or it doesn't have to be that Pollyanna-ish if you don't want it to be. But so what's everyone looking forward to at the end of their workday today, right? So just asking different questions to learn about the people within your organization. And I would say take those 4 types of curiosity we talked about at the top of the episode and invite people to figure out which one they are, which one they're most and explore it a little bit and talk about it. Even conversations like that, I think just creates this environment of a little bit more engaging, a little bit more caring about one another. And that brings you together collaboratively as a team.
I think that's great because we also don't know what people are dealing with on a day-to-day at different roles in their organization. We all have different stressors. We all have different responsibilities. My biggest ick is when marketers say to everybody, well, I need more content, get me more content. You're not marketers. You're not thinking about it the way that I am. So if I'm just telling you, give me more content, you're not going to give me anything of value because you aren't thinking about it in the same way that I am as far as what's going to be helpful, beneficial, and what we're trying to do versus saying hey, I would really love to get a 30-second video of you out in the field, walking a dog and showing how much energy, how important it is to get them out. And we're looking for volunteers, helping to craft those stories. And so I think what you said is brilliant because it also just helps us kind of build connections within our team to be able to then come in and say, oh, you're doing that. That's super cool. Did you know that we have this going on over here? Maybe that could help. But you would have never made that connection otherwise if you're not kind of creating those questions in a different way. Yeah,
I love it. And then I think the other one is just through our conversations and whether that's team or with your community is not giving too many details, but also not being super mysterious, right? There is nothing worse than when you're trying to get information from somebody and it's really, really vague and you're I don't know, right. But also it's annoying when you get way too many details. You're did not need to know all this. So I think that's a way, in our conversations and with our external communication, we can all kind of focus on that. Where is sort of the sweet spot for just enough details? It's like a recipe. You want it to be spicy, but you don't want it to scald their mouths off because that doesn't make them curious.
No, I love that. Okay, well, as we wrap this up, kind of we're just getting into 2025. So what are you most excited about as you continue to do this work and share about curiosity marketing? What is kind of something that you are just really excited to explore and continue working on this year?
Well, thank you for the question. And I want to ask it back at you. So I am focusing in 2025 a lot on like brand voice, which I've always done, but I'm going like really deeply into brand voice and understanding people's voice, because to me, I think that sharing like our personality and who we really are, it's one of the best ways to create curious collaborations. So I like to help my clients in that way. So that's like my big focus for the new year. And I would love to hear yours.
Oh, geez. Well, mine is we have a lot of resources that we've been pumping out over the last few years, and they just need some refresh and revamping. So I'm really excited to jump back into all of our kind of downloadables and give them a little bit of a facelift and kind of reshare some new strategies. I mean, it's all the same because we work very much on foundational stuff, but just kind of updating it, you know, with all the things around AI and all the goodness there. So I'm just excited to kind of jump back into old content and clean it up, which, we're starting to work on right now. So
good. I love that. One of the questions I always ask in my reflections is like, what am I bringing back and like making new? So that is such a good answer.
Yep. I love it. Well, Emily, this was fantastic. So many good tips. And I just like that it's a new way to think about how we show up for each other, how we show up for our community, how we show up for our donors, and just being like good humans and respecting each other and inviting people to have conversations. So I think that's great. If people want to learn more about you, connect with you, how do they do that?
Yeah, it's super. Thank you so much for having me. This was a lot of fun, and you ask really good, unique questions, which I love.
Oh, good.
My website is just my first and last name, emilyaborn.com, and you can connect with me in all the places, LinkedIn, wherever you are, I am there.
Yeah, and we'll have everything linked up in the show notes at thefirstclick.net/288, so you can check those all out there. But Emily, this was such a pleasure. Thank you so much.
Thank you. Have a great new year.
Okay, one of my favorite conversations. So much fun. I love Emily's insight into how we can approach these conversations externally and internally. So I'm curious about what you are going to do first. How are you going to start to implement this into your organization and into the way that you connect with people and connect with fundraisers or with your funders and your donors and foundations and grants and the community that you serve, to help build better connections and showcase brand awareness for who you are and what you do, the amazing work that you're doing every single day. So make sure you head on over to thefirstclick.net/288, grab the show notes, grab the resources that are mentioned here, and make sure you hit that subscribe button where you listen. Now remember, we have bonus episodes coming out throughout the year, and the only way you're going to know about them is if you are subscribed. So make sure you subscribe and hit that notification bell on YouTube. And leave us a review on Apple Podcasts or Spotify while you're there. Helps us get this podcast out to more nonprofits that need the support just like you. Thank you for being a listener. I appreciate you so much, and I can't wait to see you in the next one.